A caravan stretched across the Sahara for miles. 60,000 men, 100 camels loaded with gold, and at the center of it all, one man whose wealth was so staggering that his single journey through Egypt collapsed the value of gold for over a decade. This is not legend, this is recorded history, and almost nobody was taught it in school. Before the world knew his name, West Africa had already built one of the wealthiest civilizations on Earth. This is the story of the Mali Empire, a nation of gold, scholars, and soldiers whose rise reshaped global trade and whose fall was buried by centuries of forgetting. If this is the first time you're hearing it, that's not an accident. That's the point of this video. Stay with it to the end, because what you're about to learn changes how you see African history for good. Subscribe now, because what you're about to learn changes how you see African history for good. Long before Mali existed, the region was shaped by an earlier power, the Ghana Empire, a trading kingdom that controlled the movement of gold and salt across West Africa for centuries. By the 1200s, Ghana's dominance had weakened, fractured by internal rivalries and external pressure. Into this vacuum stepped a small kingdom called Mali, ruled by a clan known as the Keita. Their most consequential leader began his life not as a king, but as an exile. Sundiata Keita was born around 1217, the son of a local ruler. Historical accounts describe him as physically weak in childhood, unable to walk for years, mocked and underestimated by rivals within his own family. When a warlord named Sumanguru Kante seized control of the region and drove Sundiata's family into exile, few expected the boy to return, let alone to lead. But Sundiata did return. He gathered allies from neighboring chiefdoms, built a coalition army, and in 1235 met Sumanguru's forces at the Battle of Kirina. The battle was decisive. Sumanguru's forces were broken, and Sundiata emerged as the unquestioned ruler of a new unified state, the Mali Empire. What followed was not just conquest, but structure. Sundiata and the leaders who fought alongside him established a governing charter known as the Kurukan Fuga, an oral constitution that organized clans, defined social order, and set rules for governance that would guide Mali for generations. This wasn't a loose tribal alliance, it was the foundation of an organized state built on law, hierarchy, and shared purpose. And beneath that structure lay the resource that would make Mali legendary: gold. The empire sat directly on top of two of the richest gold fields in the medieval world, Bambouk and Bouré. Control of these mines, combined with control of the trans-Saharan trade routes, gave Mali something no other power in the region had ever fully secured: a monopoly on the movement of gold from the heart of Africa to the markets of North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. For nearly a century, Mali expanded. Cities grew, trade routes solidified, wealth accumulated. And then, in 1312, power passed to the ruler who would turn Mali from a regional force into a name spoken in royal courts from Cairo to Venice. His name was Mansa Musa. Historians still debate the exact figures, but by many estimates, Mansa Musa remains one of the wealthiest individuals in recorded history. His fortune not counted in currency, but in control. He commanded access to gold reserves so vast that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe them accurately. Mali under his rule stretched across roughly 2,000 miles, incorporating over 20 cities and vast trade networks that connected the interior of Africa to the Mediterranean world. But it was not his territory that made Mansa Musa a global legend. It was a single journey. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out on the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. This was not a modest procession. Contemporary accounts describe a convoy of tens of thousands of people, soldiers, officials, servants, and enslaved attendants accompanying the emperor across the Sahara, through Cairo, and into the Arabian Peninsula. Camels carried hundreds of pounds of gold. Some accounts describe him distributing so much gold in Cairo as charity, as payment, as diplomatic gesture that the value of gold in Egyptian markets collapsed for years afterward. Prices didn't recover for over a decade. This is not exaggeration for spectacle. Egyptian scholars at the time documented the disruption directly, describing an economic shock caused by the sudden flood of gold into their markets. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage became one of the most economically significant single journeys in medieval history, not because of what he conquered, but because of what he simply gave away in passing. The journey also placed Mali permanently on the world map, quite literally. Just decades later, European cartographers produced the Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most detailed maps of its era. On it, depicted in the region of West Africa, sits a crowned African king holding a golden orb, Mansa Musa. To European mapmakers who had never set foot in West Africa, his empire was already understood as a place of unmatched wealth. When Mansa Musa returned home from Mecca, he brought back more than fame. He returned with scholars, architects, and Islamic teachers who would help transform Mali's cities into centers of learning and architecture. Timbuktu, once a modest trading outpost on the edge of the Niger River, was elevated into one of the most important intellectual centers in the medieval world. The Sankore Mosque and its associated center of learning became home to what is now often described as one of the first great universities on the African continent. Manuscripts on astronomy, law, medicine, and theology were copied, studied, and traded. Scholars traveled from across the Islamic world to study and teach there. Some estimates suggest Timbuktu at its height housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, a body of written knowledge that stood as direct evidence against the myth, still repeated far too often, that pre-colonial Africa lacked written intellectual tradition. This was the paradox of Mali's golden age, a civilization built on the movement of raw material, gold, salt, ivory, that used that wealth to build something far more enduring: libraries, universities, legal systems, architecture that still stands today, including the Great Mosque of Djenné, one of the largest mud brick structures on Earth. But none of this happened peacefully. Behind the trade caravans and the scholars stood an army. Wealth without protection is simply a target, and Mali's rulers understood this completely. The empire maintained control over its trade routes through a combination of military strength and administrative reach. Regional governors, known as farbas, managed provinces and reported directly to the Mansa, ensuring that gold and salt kept flowing along protected corridors. The empire's cavalry and infantry forces were used not for random conquest, but for a specific strategic purpose: securing choke points along the trans-Saharan trade network, particularly around the critical trading cities of Timbuktu and Gao. Control of Gao mattered because it linked Mali to the Niger River trade corridor. Control of Timbuktu mattered because it linked Mali to the desert caravan routes heading north toward Morocco and Egypt. Whoever held these cities held the arteries of West African commerce. Mali's military campaigns throughout the 14th century were, in large part, campaigns to secure and defend these arteries against rival powers, vassal states, and Tuareg raiders operating along the desert fringe. This military structure allowed Mali to project stability across an enormous territory for decades. But empires of this scale come with an inherent cost. The larger Mali grew, the harder it became to hold.
Distant provinces grew resentful of central taxation. Vassal rulers, especially in the Songhai regions to the east, began testing the limits of Malian authority. The same military apparatus that had built the empire's wealth now had to be stretched thinner and thinner to defend it. The turning point came not on a battlefield, but in the palace. Mansa Musa died around 1337, and the succession that followed lacked the stability of his reign. Subsequent rulers struggled to match his combination of military authority, administrative skill, and economic control. Some Mansas were capable, others were not. Internal power struggles weakened central authority at exactly the moment the empire needed unity most. Sensing the shift, a vassal state that had once answered to Mali began to assert its independence. The Songhai people, based around the city of Gao, started to break away from Malian control during the 15th century. Under the leadership of Sunni Ali, who rose to power around 1464, Songhai transformed from a subject territory into an aggressive rising power. Sunni Ali expanded Songhai's military reach and critically seized control of Timbuktu itself, the very city that had once symbolized Mali's intellectual and economic dominance.
This was the beginning of the end. As Songhai grew stronger under Sunni Ali and later under Askia Muhammad, Mali's territory contracted. Trade routes that had once fed directly into Malian treasuries were rerouted through Songhai-controlled cities. The empire that had once stretched across 2,000 miles shrank, province by province, until it was a fraction of its former self, clinging to its western heartland, while the Songhai Empire rose in its place as the dominant power of the region. Mali did not vanish overnight. It persisted in a diminished form for generations, a shadow of the empire Mansa Musa had ruled. But its era of dominance was over. Ironically, the Songhai Empire that replaced it would eventually suffer a similar fate, rather than external force, rather than internal decay. In 1591, a Moroccan army, equipped with gunpowder weapons that West African forces had not yet adopted at scale, crossed the Sahara and shattered Songhai's forces at the Battle of Tondibi. It was a brutal demonstration of how quickly technological shifts could undo centuries of accumulated regional power. The great trading empires of the Niger River, the successors to Mali's legacy, never fully recovered. What followed was centuries of fragmentation, colonial intrusion, and historical erasure. As European powers turned their attention toward the transatlantic slave trade and later toward colonization, the historical memory of West Africa's medieval trading empires was pushed to the margins of global history. The story of a civilization that had once produced the richest man in recorded history, that had built one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world, was reduced in most history books to a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. But the evidence never disappeared. It sat in Cairo's historical records, describing the gold market crash of 1324. It sat in the Catalan Atlas, preserved in European archives. It sat in the surviving manuscripts of Timbuktu, thousands of which have been rediscovered, catalogued, and preserved in recent decades by historians and local archivists working to protect them from decay, conflict, and neglect. Modern archaeological work continues to uncover the scale of Mali's cities, its trade infrastructure, and its administrative sophistication, physical proof of a civilization that was neither primitive nor peripheral, but central to the medieval global economy. This is what makes the story of Mali essential, not just as African history, but as world history. This was not an isolated kingdom operating outside the currents of global trade. It was one of the engines driving that trade. Gold pulled from Malian soil ended up in Venetian coins, in Cairo's markets, in the hands of European monarchs who had no idea where it truly originated.
The wealth of a continent that would later be stripped, colonized, and mischaracterized as historically poor was for centuries quite literally the source of some of the richest fortunes the medieval world had ever seen. The empire that made Africa rich did not fall because it lacked ambition, intelligence, or power. It fell the way most empires eventually fall, through succession crises, overextension, and the emergence of stronger rivals. Its decline was not a reflection of African civilization's limits. It was simply history, following the same patterns that toppled Rome, that fractured the Mongol Empire, that would one day dissolve the colonial powers that came after it.
If there is one thing worth carrying away from this story, it is this. History did not begin with colonization, and African wealth is not a modern invention. It has a documented, factual, centuries-deep foundation built by rulers like Sundiata Keita and Mansa Musa, protected by armies who understood the value of what they were defending, and sustained by scholars who filled cities like Timbuktu with knowledge the world is still rediscovering today. This is a story that deserves to be told accurately and told often. If you learned something today that you were never taught in school, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments which empire you want uncovered next. Share this video, because the only way history like this survives is if people refuse to let it be buried again.